send you the link.
Okay. Hold on.
I've got it, so I'll just send it to you.
Yeah. Got it.
Cool.
Chapter 6, man. Okay, got it.
Yes. Cool. I
There
can
we
see
go.
you're in. Okay. So what's all this about? Let me show you. Relevant quotes. Basically, this is the beginning of that chapter on I think so. Chapter 6 is man, and this is from the beginning, and it's saying like Ayn Rand refers to this as an inquiry of the study of man's metaphysical nature, and then I bolded another quote. A view of man is a step on the road to ethics, but the view itself does not include value judgments. It rests on metaphysics and epistemology, but it's obviously, I think it says later, is not exhausted by metaphysics and epistemology. That's the next quote. So this is pre-ethics, but it's still a bit of metaphysics and it's still a bit of knowledge from epistemology. Is there other, like, do you know if in other philosophies, is there something like this? Is it something specific to objectivism where there's this thing called the study of man's metaphysical nature?
It's not really given a field in itself. Usually it might be like touching on psychology sometimes and touching on, of course, epistemological questions. Objectivism likes to think in terms like that. As far as if you want to define ethics, we need to understand the nature of man. That's not necessarily unique to objectivism, but this is like more like an approach of putting a focus on it.
Yeah.
That we're not just saying there's moral facts and then it's just our relationship to moral facts, but that the moral facts are derived from or come from the nature of man. I'm not exactly sure how other ethical systems might view the nature of man. So there's all sorts of views on that. What I can say as far as Aristotelian ways of thinking are usually about the nature of the thing and then deriving or figuring out principles from that. Like I was showing you about Aristotle last time, that's a much more teleological way of thinking. That's the phrase that you should remember, teleology, because it's like the purpose of things. Like for what purpose? It's like studying the study of purpose, more or less, like the teleology of man. Like for what purpose does he exist? Why does he exist? Or what's in his nature? Those are sort of questions. An Aristotelian framework would approach it that way.
Is that related to the thing called the is-ought dichotomy? Is that from objectivism or from somewhere else where there's like something is, the nature is, and so we should do this?
It's from David Hume. He came up with the is-ought dichotomy, or I don't know if he phrased it as dichotomy, but he was trying to express an erroneous way of thinking that Hume was trying to say merely because something is not sufficient to say what one ought to do. Like I can't just say that the sky is blue, therefore I should always tell the truth. Or I mean that's a more extreme example, but maybe just because the world is structured a certain way doesn't in itself mean that you should do something. He's trying to say that getting from a descriptive statement, he's saying you couldn't get to an ought statement objectively. Like you couldn't derive from the facts an ought. And that's what Hume was trying to argue. And Rand was saying that's not really true. I mean, yeah, we shouldn't just take something as really the existence of something as proof.
Yep.
But that her argument would be that by discussing the nature of man, we could see what objectively he needs to survive and flourish. And we can make a claim about defining morality as finding those answers to what leads to our flourishing and So in that sense, an is can lead to an ought, contra Hume, who was saying that you can't get to the ought from the is. He would say that, oh, just because man is that way is not enough in itself to say man ought to be rational and things like that.
Yeah. And
Hume is more of a skeptic. So usually he questions everything, and he's very critical of evidence. So.
And I guess it depends on the view of what our purpose is. Isn't that Aristotelian thing of like, if you think that the goal is to flourish, then you can say that that is does imply an ought, because the ought is morality itself, and you've defined the morality as this thing. So
more or less, yeah, that there, at least by Rand's way of answering the question, is that we look at the nature of man, we see for what reason he does exist, for what purpose does he exist for, what's his nature to exist, acting towards. And if that's his nature, you should do that. Yeah. Insofar as that's his nature, you should strive to. I mean, that's a whole framework in itself. And Hume was probably trying to argue against even the Aristotelian framework, thinking there's errors in it. But that's just giving context to these different ways of thinking. And that's what Rand was trying to address. Hume's concern.
Okay. And going back to Aristotle, when you said the study of teleology was the study of the nature of things and what principles you can extract from that study, remember we had that conversation about pride, and he was like looking at this man and this man, and this man walks slowly, this man walks fast. That thing, did he was that a similar process? So he extracted the principle and then like, you should be prideful. Is that what that process is?
Earlier in the book, he was kind of discussing more the nature of things, not in the way that Rand did. He didn't really phrase it as, he didn't emphasize those points, but when he looked at things, it was always in terms of what's the nature of it and how do we go from there.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by Aristotelian. That's the framework Rand builds on. That's where she's working from. And that's why I bring up Aristotle plenty, and why she brings him up plenty, because she's pointing out that it's not necessarily out of left field. She's telling you about this way of thinking, but it's Aristotelian. There's precedent in this way of thinking. And that's what she's trying to support and emphasize.
Okay, makes sense. And what did I want to ask you? Oh, we've mentioned the word nature a few times, and obviously I've seen it heaps in this text that I'm reading. What is that? Just the way I'm interpreting it based on context is that it's just fundamental features, but then, or the essential attribute of the thing being studied. But then, like, how did, if Aristotle and all these other people are talking about nature of things, but they're not using an objectivist theory of concepts, what are they talking about? Like, well, is it the same thing? Like,
Aristotle's theory was more about essentialism, is how we define it, metaphysical essentialism.
Yeah.
And that's what Aristotle thinks about. Like, I told you about, like, the redness.
I remember.
Like, the appleness of an apple is something in
fatherness in a father. That was the example.
Things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So he is talking about the same thing, Aristotle.
Well, not the same. He's saying metaphysically, it's something, a characteristic of the thing itself. That an apple has an appleness characteristic in its very existence, not just you're thinking about it, but its very existence has an essence.
Yep.
And Rand's distinction is that she focuses on epistemological essentialism.
Okay.
That she's saying there isn't an attribute that inherently makes it this thing. There isn't an appleness to an apple inherently in it that makes it an apple, but something you identify perceptually, and then you like integrate it cognitively and all that other stuff to then form a concept of it, which is making use of the essential. But the essential isn't in the thing itself. It's essential that you identify by method of reasoning and things like that.
So, okay, so Aristotle is using, when he's talking about the nature of something, in his case he's still talking about an essential, but his view of what an essential is slightly different. Although, let's say, maybe I'm guessing most of the time it is referring, like when he's looking at pride, he is getting at the core thing, or when he does, because he doesn't have a kind of conscious framework of how to identify what an essential is. Like you've mentioned, it's more just a thing that is impressed upon you. But when you're reading him, if I do read him, you could sort of read it in the same way, right? Nature is, he's seeing it as a thing in itself. But he's trying to find the thing that does the most work, or the fundamental, but he doesn't know how he's finding it. He just thinks it's impressed upon him. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that's a fair way to put it. And that's also a way to characterize what Rand thinks Aristotle got wrong.
Yeah.
That way of thinking leads to errors and bad ways of thinking, but at core, that she's still working within that essentialist framework.
Got it.
That there's an essential characteristic, and other philosophers might say it's not about an essential characteristic, but what Wittgenstein called family resemblances.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just grab a group of, say, apples, and they have a resemblance, and you label it apple. Not that you're actually saying there's a fundamental about it or anything. It's just that there's a resemblance among them.
Yeah.
Incidentally, and you label it that way, as opposed to Rand saying that you group things together because of some fundamental relationship they have, or a similarity that they all have, and you can integrate it as a concept. So that's the sort of distinction she's would make.
What's the difference between a resemblance and a similarity then? To me, it sounds like he's saying that they have things in common, but there's no one thing that is like more important than the others. Kind of, is that right? Or it's like,
yeah, that's Wittgenstein.
okay.
Yeah, which is that'd be more like nominalism.
Yeah.
And that way of thinking, just they're more incidental things that there's no objective reason to do these things. It's just you do it for whatever practical or irrational or whatever reason there might be to group them that way. It's like it didn't have to be that way, and they're like, it's just like, oh, there's no essential here anyway.
Have you read much of Wittgenstein?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Not very much.
Do you know if by any chance does he have an ethics, or is this like what is he an epistemologist, or what is that?
He worked more with philosophy of language and trying to think there's not much inherent meaning in it anyway. He used to be there's two phases of Wittgenstein. One was a very rigid, everything's deduced. You have these core principles and you deduce everything from there. But then he rejected, you can't do philosophy that way, he thought. It's like, in fact, there's no stable rules about anything really. It's just whatever. And our language doesn't make much sense. It's just like arbitrary assertions about how we feel and things like that. So then he just went to say that, well, there is no meaning in language, really. When we say we're sad, how do I know that my sad is your sad? And maybe we're not even thinking of the same thing anyway. So it's all destabilized, and nothing's really by nature objective or true in that sense. I don't know what he thinks about objectivity in general, but as far as human language and communication, it isn't objective in his eyes, and that mostly what we label things is not by nature objective or anything like that.
Wow, he studied language like David did. He's another professor of linguistics. But it's interesting because I've heard people say that before. Like I've gotten into discussions with, not even in a like, the context wasn't even a philosophical conversation, but people ask those questions, which I wonder if they ask those questions because they heard that from somewhere, or they came up with the questions themselves. That's pretty interesting that he looks at those questions. Do you know if he's got any like, you know, when you study it with a framework of saying, okay, well, we've got this theory of concepts, that's wouldn't be correct. There still might be heaps of value in, like, do you know if there is any value in studying him, or is it like, is there any, are there, like, does he have any interesting things to see on language or communication? Or
I never really thought so.
okay.
I know a little bit and never felt compelled to read
Yeah.
it. Maybe there is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some interesting questions in philosophy of language
Yeah.
that I think he probably has, but I don't know what they are. And I'm not really that into philosophy of language, so I never delved into it.
Okay.
But, yeah.
That
But I
ties.
think there's
Yeah. Sorry.
generally value in reading philosophers that even you're pretty sure you'll disagree with, because they at least give you more questions to think about and more things to answer.
Mm-hmm.
It can deepen your understanding if you feel ready to go there. It can. That's really the function I see of that.
That ties well into this next question. So, you know, like here we're exploring, we're taking a philosophical view of man. It's a little bit from metaphysics, a little bit from epistemology, but it's not like a field in and of itself. So is there, it sounds like there is then a field, uh, basically, like you could study everything with a philosophical view, like approaching it for the fundamentals.
Yes.
Like I've done romantic relationship and chimpanzees. I don't know if that's a good example, but that, and then you've given language. Like, you know, there's no, I haven't seen anything so far in the philosophy of language here, or at least nothing's called that. So is there, yeah, is that a thing? Like, but then can't, if that was a thing, doesn't that mean that philosophy just turns into a subject that studies everything? Do you know, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like,
It.
I
I
would have thought it's a
know.
delimited thing.
It's. I think there's something to say when you're kind of at the borderline of the two, that you're applying these philosophical questions that don't necessarily require the detailed knowledge of the science itself, but you're applying philosophy to these very um, rigidly defined frameworks or rigidly defined ideas. It's more about what philosophical principles do you need to think about psychology, for example, and that would be like
Mm-hmm.
philosophy of psychology, or what philosophical principles do you need to think properly about linguistics would be philosophy of language, and so on about any field. And
Oh, okay.
to some extent, I think there's a matter of going back and forth between the two, that sometimes by understanding more math, you can inform your philosophical concepts even more. Like we talked about before about the spiral theory of knowledge, that you kind of like you gain more knowledge and you can go back and that informs your other principles,
Yep.
which could be philosophical and so on. But yeah, like philosophy of math, philosophy of language, philosophy of physics. I mean, pretty much anything you could attach philosophy of onto. But usually some big ones, I guess, like philosophy of mind is really big. Philosophy of language is big. Philosophy of math. Those are some pretty big categories that get a lot of attention.
Isn't philosophy of mind just epistemology?
Not necessarily, because there's also
Mm.
questions of what does it mean to be conscious? What, why, how is it that we're conscious? Is that, are we all reducible to just our neurons and that's it? That's all consciousness is, or why are there conscious experiences anyway? Um,
So it sounds
another
like a bit
question
of
would be what,
science. It sounds like
a little
it's
bit,
involving science too.
but more like philosophy, like what does it mean to be a self? Like, how do you know you are an individual as opposed to, or whatever else you might think of with that. But usually more philosophical, because it's more like an extension on questions asked before. Like, I'm sure there's things within Plato that could really apply to philosophy of mind. It's really just an extension of these principles. And like you say, when you get maybe on a, you think you go on a tangent and go into really deep, nitty gritty questions. That's what I would say is like philosophy of mind. When we get to the very nitty gritty of a question, like how do you know you're still you when you wake up? And you're getting
Oh,
really
okay.
into like, are you the same person as you were yesterday, or in what sense are you the same? Which can derive from something like I think there's a thought experiment by, I forget which Greek philosopher, but it was called the Ship of Theseus. And you could say you have a ship, well, Theseus's ship, and you take it apart piece by piece and reassemble the ship elsewhere. Is it still Theseus' ship when you reconstruct it? So you
Okay.
take it all apart and you put it all together again. Is it
Yeah.
the same ship? I
Yeah.
mean, that's a deeper question of like identity. Or you
Yeah.
can even
Okay.
apply that to your mind. Like,
Cool. That sounds. It does sound like it's study of epistemologies, meaning everyone's different view in epistemology through thought experiments and cool questions like that.
well, if anything, it's just philosophy of mind is where thought experiments really help a lot
Yep.
because there's these, you're trying to, I think, about who you are in the first place. I mean, in a way, that could be a study of the nature of man. What does it mean to be yourself? Why are you conscious? Questions that really don't apply to much else other than humanity. So, in a way, you could say it's like that. That's the closest thing I think.
How to like look how long. I mean, I've spent I don't know, quite a few hours reading and studying just this book, Opar. And like, how do people get through multiple philosophers? Like, this is not easy. And I have you that I'm asking questions. How would you possibly get through like, oh, let me just read this philosopher and really understand them. Let me read Kant. Let me read this. I don't know how you know, even if I was doing it full time, I reckon it would be quite hard.
Yeah, in a way, it's a matter of, I don't know, just absorbing it in the right context. Just you keep using it, and eventually it just sticks. And
Yeah,
you just trust your mind that you'll do it. It'll happen if you just keep doing it.
yeah,
It just one day it's like, oh yeah, it makes sense, and I can explain it to someone. It'll just like start making sense. One day is the best way to put it. And when I approach studying philosophy, it's more like I focus on the one thing I'm reading. I try not to think about too much else of other philosophers, just my thoughts and that philosopher, whatever they might be, and then later I could just repeat that process when I read somebody else, or even when I reread that chapter. Like I've reread some things Rand wrote plenty of times just to remember what was said and just maybe question things again if I need to.
yeah,
But mostly it's just a gradual process. Like you just go one book at a time. If you don't quite get it, I mean, if you get the gist, that's usually good enough. You just move on and you just keep going and going. I know I would read just a bunch of objectivist books, just whatever interests me, and just read one. Then I might find another book I like by Aristotle. Well, I only read one Aristotle book when I was studying Rand early on. Like I read that and maybe read some Nietzsche later on. Just throw things in to change things up a bit, so I'm not always in one frame of thinking all the time.
yeah.
You're just it. But I do admit I've had some philosophy courses at university too, so it's not that I was entirely on my own. I took at least 3 courses in college on philosophy, so that helped me understand what philosophy is about.
Yeah.
It
Did you?
helped.
But you know, when you're doing, I don't know what university's like there. Can you go in and like speak to a tutor every day if you wanted to? Because that would be then I'd maybe even go to university part time. But if you can't, to me, it's pointless because the courses are so expensive, and you're like, what am I doing this for?
Yeah,
You just have someone talking. I can watch a thing on edX. Can you do that
yeah.
in the US? You can speak to like a tutor every single day or whatever for a long time.
Um. Well, teachers normally have office hours,
Ah,
and
there
that
you
are
go.
set up every
Same
week.
scam.
Yeah. So
It's a scam. Anyway, um, all right. So we'll go back to this ethics, I think. I got the next question is actually let's sort of go back to this. Like with the study of man, couldn't I say that, well, like if you're just randomly studying man to get to ethics, like couldn't you also do a philosophical view of chimpanzees? Like obviously we discussed a field of study, like the philosophy of science, the philosophy of language, but like if this isn't like, if it's just you can do philosophical views of different things, like couldn't I also write a whole thing about the philosophical view of chimpanzees?
I mean,
Maybe
in
that I'm trying to
principle,
ask as many dumb questions as I can so I can
in principle,
clarify all of it.
sure, but why is more the question.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you do. Do you need to? I mean, here we're trying to find ethics for man. We're not trying to find ethics for chimpanzees. That's the most direct way I can put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can study it, but would it tell you anything?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a separate question. Are they similar enough that you can get some principles?
Right.
Maybe. I mean, you might say something about biology and that they're animals too when they try to live, and there's limitations they have based on non-conceptual thinking, or you could claim that the difference is conceptual thought, so it's not irrelevant to think about chimpanzees. It could be relevant in terms of understanding the fundamentals of what it means to be man as opposed to chimpanzee, things like that.
Okay, I think I've reached my limit of silly questions, so we'll skip that one. But yeah, I see what you're saying, that this is like with a purpose towards ethics, and that maybe it is part of ethics, although it's like a process of inductively reaching it rather than, because this is not deduction. I think you pointed that out to me, like one of the earlier sessions, with like you're looking at things like the axioms. They're not just this thing you deduce everything from, but you would make observations. So this is part of that process.
Yes.
Okay, this is the same thing. Maybe it's described as a center of a system of thought. I guess he means center in this sense. It's a linked between abstract base and practical culmination. Like he's just, for this context, he's defining the center as this, right? That's sort of what my
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool.
In a way, that's what I mean when I say doing the most work when you think about reason. I mean, it's similar. That I'm trying to say is like the center of everything. It's not that everything is deduced from that, but everything connects to it in that it receives a lot of crosstalk, I guess you could say, between things, thoughts, and concepts. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, and the other feature is that I still need to get to that reason section, but the other feature we discussed was that it's not just the crosstalk, which is almost like the frequency, but the cognitive effort, like the amount of integrations
Right.
and whatever else that it needs to be connected with, which is difficult. So, but in this case, it's clearly just we're not making any comment on the difficulty of this cognitive effort or anything like that. It's just literally, this is just a literary thing. He's just defining it as a link between abstract base and practice, the practical culmination.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, that's a
All
way
right.
of connecting it all in more practical terms, not merely theoretical, but like it's where everything comes together and its relevance to your life and your way of thinking. And it's almost like a man-centered philosophy is what Peacock is kind of pointing out here, that objectivism is, as Rand has said, a philosophy for living life on Earth, and man qua man. I mean, those are the main things that it's more than selfishness. It's always man qua man is the thing. Man qua man, what's the...
That I actually like that added. That makes makes more sense to me now. This whole section is like, because this whole philosophy is about man, then it just makes sense to discuss this as the center of a system of thought. But maybe in another philosophy that won't be the case. It won't be about man. It's about God, for example. So
Could be.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That makes sense.
Well, I just say the ethics is about man qua man.
Oh, you said ethics.
Yeah, I should say ethics is man qua man, but an objectivism is a philosophy for living life on Earth. I mean, the life on Earth isn't necessarily ethics, but Rand uses man qua man in the context of ethics.
Yep.
Because we're trying to say what's right for man in general as a category, as a general concept. Not necessarily what's right for each very narrow, specific instance, but qua man, meaning that, like man per se and man in general.
Okay. I'm stopping the recording.